Welcome to The State of Us. Real people with honest opinions and the future of responsible media. Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
According to a new survey conducted by the Conference Board in New York, 54% of U.S. workers are satisfied with their employment. Satisfaction climbed by almost 3% from the prior year, which marks a near record increase in the survey's history. With workers reporting being much more at ease about their job security, and millennials have experienced a surge in confidence regarding their wages. Why does all of this matter? Well, of course, the mindset of the workforce directly correlates in many ways to how strong our economy is and what the future holds for all of us, retired, working, or otherwise. So today we're going to be joined by two of the individuals who worked on this survey with the Conference Board. But before we get to them, we, of course, couldn't begin any critical conversation without
your friendly redneck liberal, Lance Jackson.
Well, we all are interested in this because everybody is either a worker or has been a worker or is still, could rejoin the workforce at any time based on the economy. So it's nice to know what is happening out there and how people feel about it.
Right. I mean, you're retired. Well, semi-retired.
Semi-retired.
I mean, you do this and
I'm working, I'm coaching. So I've got a little bit of work for money and
right.
The economy takes a downturn. I might
have to go
join
do something
again.
Else.
So it's nice to know. So I think this show, goes to everybody's interest, and it's great to have the people who came up with the numbers to explain to us even further how this all shook out.
So we're joined first here by Calvin Rong, who is a research analyst on the Conference Board's Human Capital team, where he assists with the project management and execution of human capital-related research projects and reports. Calvin, welcome to the show.
Pleasure to be here, Justin.
Calvin, before I dive into the questions, for those of us who are not experts in your subject matter, can you break down a little bit of exactly what it is that you do, maybe in layman's terms for us?
Yeah, so what I do as a research analyst, it's a lot of data analysis, it's a lot of survey building, but I essentially keep the gears rolling in the Conference Board. I make sure the human capital projects are on time and they're executed properly.
So the first thing we want to look at is Lance and I have gone through this entire survey, the entire report that was sent to us, and also the synopsis that was provided. But we want to walk people through this to make sure, and starting with that very first statistic I shared, according to the poll, nearly 54% of U.S. employees feel satisfied with their jobs. Why is that significant, Calvin? I mean, I think to most people, if they've never heard this number before, in other words, what percentage of people are satisfied with their job, they may say, well, that doesn't sound very good. Only half of people are satisfied with their job. But why is 54% significant?
Well, I mean, you have half the story right already. Like 54%, if you just look at this year, it does say, yeah, we have a lot of way to go. If you think about what satisfaction is like a baseline. Like, you're okay at your job. And it's true, only about half of us feel satisfied at their job. But if you look at the longer trend here, back in 2010, we were at 42.6. Now we're at 53.7. We're seeing a substantial increase, an incremental increase after the recession. So we are seeing recession recovery in job satisfaction.
Okay. And for our listeners, by the way, if you want to see, because I know sometimes, at least for me, these charts and graphs, as Lance will tell you, are important to my understanding of information. At thestateofus.org, as is our policy, we're going to link the news release provided by the Conference Board. And one of the first things you'll see is that those numbers that Calvin was referencing, that 42.6% back in 2010 on an upward trajectory. Now, also to put that, though, in some historical context, which I think Lance will appreciate, all the way back, survey started in 1987. Is that correct, Calvin?
Yeah, survey started in 1987.
Okay. And at the time, that first survey found that satisfaction was at 61.1%. And then slowly, kind of fell and saw its low point in 2010, and now is back on that upward trajectory. So the next thing we want to look at is it seems like, and one of the things that I thought was great about this survey is we got some insight into what contributing factors go into how satisfied people are at their job or what they prioritize. And it seems that things like people's interest in their work, like their job security and other similar factors, are the main contributors to job satisfaction. Although on the other hand, the economics of their job, like the bonus plan and a company's continuing development program, seem to be detracting from further satisfaction, or they're ranked lower in people's interests. Can you break that down a little bit for us?
Sure, happily. So before we get into this, we talk about it as drivers in the report. And if I had to break that down a little bit, if I ask you, Justin, how satisfied are you with your job? I can then ask you, well, what about your job makes you, X amount satisfied? So that's essentially what we looked at. We looked at the individual components of a job and how strong they actually influence overall job satisfaction. And we get some pretty interesting, distinct groups. So just to stop at the top line stuff, the things that people are most satisfied with are things like people at work, job security, physical environment, interest at work. And what I think is also commute at work. And what I think is really notable about this lump of points here is that all of these things are things that people have control over. People can really choose who they want to talk to at work. They can choose a job based off of their own interests, and they can find a job that's within close community distance to them. So it's kind of a selection bias that, of course, they'll be more satisfied with those elements.
That makes sense. And I think one of the things that we found interesting, and I know that Lance wants to tackle, is I wonder, now that you've got the millennials being a big part, if not the major part of the workforce at this point, that I assume is something that you found is probably a contributing factor to some of these shifting priorities in terms of what leads to their satisfaction at work. Is that right?
Well, I wouldn't be surprised if that is, but asking that question is a little bit beyond the scope of our current research.
Okay. So you may not have the specific indicators.
Yeah, no, but I know that there's some other research that looks into how millennials are shaping the workforce and how things like work-life balance are being valued more by millennials, and that's really guiding work culture. But I don't know much of that off the top of my head.
So do you know what you've got the 4 quadrants here? The low driver, high satisfaction, low driver, low satisfaction, and high driver, high satisfaction. Did the respondents put those categories there? Was that based on, so like if I took this survey, you'd ask me what's the most important thing to me to the least important thing. And then that's how they were put in each of these quadrants, as whether or not they were really important to the people who worked. Is that how it was set up, or was it different than that?
Yeah, you're half right. So the survey itself, we asked people to rate how satisfied they are on 23 components, things like commute to work, health plan, pension, sick leave, as well as their overall satisfaction. And that goes from a 1 to 5 scale, 1 being least satisfied and 5 being most satisfied. And then the scatter plot that you're talking about, the thing with the 4 quadrants, on the left-hand side, the y-axis, that is the percent of people who are satisfied with that individual components. Mm-hmm. And then the x-axis, it's the correlation of that component to the overall job satisfaction, or in layman's terms, how strong of a driver it is to overall job satisfaction.
Okay. I was very interested, being a little bit of an older worker, how that the health plan and the pension / retirement plan is a low driver. Is that just something workers aren't thinking about? I mean, I'm thinking just with the amount that healthcare is in the news and, people wanting to change it and everything. I found it interesting that workers are saying, well, the health plans, I'm not real satisfied, but it's not that important to me either, compared to, the work-life balance, the workload, the communication channels and those things. Am I understanding that correctly? And do you have any other numbers that would say why that is? Why, the health plan and the pension for the job are not as important as some of these other factors?
Well, it's hard to say like how much each individual person values health plans and retirement plans. But what I think is notable about these 2 components in particular is that these things are kind of set when you start your job. So you kind of know what you're getting into when you apply for and accept a job. So maybe that's why it isn't as big of a overall driver of job satisfaction. These are kind of beefsteaks. This is a starting point, really.
Right. So people kind of know in other words, they might not be very satisfied with it, but they also don't look at it as something that's likely to change. So therefore, they're not ranking it as high because they knew what, like you said, they knew what they were getting into before they started. It wasn't one of those things that's like, oh, well, I expect that will change a lot over the course of my employment with a certain employer.
No, exactly. And a big takeaway here isn't that these things aren't important. Health plans, pension plans, these things are always very important for people's stability, but it's just comparatively not a big driver of overall job satisfaction.
So we're going to continue our conversation with Calvin here, and we're going to be bringing in shortly another one of the researchers that worked on this study to get some more insight. But before we do that, we're going to take a brief moment and give you a little bit more information about the Conference Board itself. So Calvin, do you want to share a little bit about what the Conference Board is and does for people who aren't familiar with it?
So we're a global think tank focused on issues important to the business community. We're best known for economic work. We make things like the Consumer Confidence Index, but we also do a fair amount of human capital research.
Okay. And you also, for example, are the parent organization of the Committee for Economic Development in Washington, D.C., right?
Correct.
So you have a lot of different things you're working on, providing insights like this. And we appreciate you taking the time to be on. We've still got more to come. We're going to look at how men and women value different aspects of their job, because there actually are some notable differences, and we're going to break that down. Calvin's going to stick with us for that part of the conversation, but we're also going to bring in another researcher at the Conference Board who was part of this study and can hopefully bring some more information to the table on that as well. So stick around. We're going to continue this discussion, and we'll be right back.
We are The State of Us. Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
Welcome back. Nearly 54% of U.S. employees feel satisfied with their jobs, according to a new survey by the Conference Board in New York. Why is this significant? Well, that's what we've been looking at so far. There's a whole lot to break down in this survey, more than just that straight satisfaction number. But one of the key findings was that women and men value different aspects of their jobs. To speak more to this, we've already been talking with Calvin Rong, who is a research analyst at the Conference Board's Human Capital team. We're also going to bring in Dr. Robin Erickson, who is a principal researcher in the human capital practice and was also part of making this survey a reality. Robin, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, Justin.
Absolutely. So why don't you take us into this here? Tell us a little bit more about what we should take away from the findings that women and men value different aspects of their jobs.
Sure. So if you caught the first segment of the show, you heard from Calvin that we measured 23 different components of satisfaction. So we measured overall satisfaction and then actual satisfaction with 23 different components. And when we looked at which aspects of those 23 components that men are more satisfied with or women are more satisfied with, we found that it was almost a 50-50 break. So women are more satisfied with 11 of the 23 components, and men are more satisfied with 12 of the 23 components. But they're different things. And so we found that women are more satisfied with their commute to work, with the performance review process, with the physical environment, the work-life balance, and job security. And so we think that perhaps an explanation of this is that women are oftentimes responsible for, or primarily responsible for, their care of either children or parents. And so their commute to work, that work-life balance and the job security, I think may matter more to women. And then when you look at what men are currently more satisfied with, you find that they're more satisfied with their bonus plan, with their wages, with their pension or retirement plan. And we think that that might be because men are typically more likely to switch jobs. And as most people know, if you switch jobs, you're able to drive your salary up faster. And I think oftentimes men are more responsible, more primarily responsible for financial responsibilities. And so it sort of makes sense when you look at those differences.
So one of the things that I'm looking at, and thank you, I think you laid that out pretty well for people, is understanding. And I know, this is more of an analysis component probably than it is something that you have the direct numbers on, is understanding that is there a difference here in these things are communicated from a societal standpoint, or we believe these to actually be some sort of, predisposition, genetic or biological component to what's happening. Because it seems to me that this would lean more toward, old societal trends that still speak and are still part of what we do today. Men traditionally having that more flexibility and seeking the next step up, whether that's at their current job or a different job. And while there's, a huge percentage of women that are now working full time, and many of them still trying to raise a family, it makes sense that those things would be important. In other words, do you think this is mostly, related to traditional gender roles, or is there actually something else at play here?
So we talked about that. And were we just continuing stereotypes by reporting this information? I actually think that we had over 2,000 respondents in the survey. And so I think that what we're looking at is a reflection of society rather than trying to continue old stereotypes or old gender roles. I think it's the reality more than anything. And I think that the discussion can be held at a later date, or more research should be done to think about, well, how do we change some of these? I think our data just shows the reality of what life is like here in the U.S. right now.
Just a quick question, because you're sort of answering it, but see if you have a little bit more there. Do you think as more women become the main wage earner of the home, that we could see some of these change? Because we know that more women are going to school, and we know that the studies show that in the next 5 to 10 years, more women are going to be the main wage earner in the home. But yet I really did like your point about having to be the main caregiver, either for an elderly parent or for children. But do you think we'll start to see that change a little bit, and women take more saying, the wages will start to become more important? Not that they're not important now,
right,
but
right.
As Calvin explained in the first segment, there are things that are, they're all important to me, but I have to categorize them somehow. But do you think, with seeing how women are going to become more of the main wage earner, we'll see a difference or not?
So I definitely believe that we will see a difference. And I am a woman, and I am very happy to say that I definitely think we'll see a difference as our society changes.
If you actually look at gender differences between men and women on what drives their satisfaction, you do see some marked differences. What's important to notice, though, before we even touch this point, is that in terms of the top drivers of satisfaction for men and women, it's the same things. So the overall picture here is that people care about potential future growth, communication channels, recognition, and interest in work as the things that drive their satisfaction. But if you had to look at the differences, you do see these relative differences, such as men factor in wages more to their overall job satisfaction, and women factor in people at work and workload more to their overall job satisfaction.
So another question here is job satisfaction by age over time. I know we're talking about gender, but this is something that came into play for me that I thought was kind of interesting to see how this breakdown works. When you look at the under 35 crowd, there was what appears to be a relatively large increase from 2014 to 2015 in job satisfaction by age group. I mean, they went from right around 47% all the way up to like 56% in 1 year. And then it stayed relatively high all the way through 2017. And then we saw this drop that brought everybody kind of right in line. And what I mean by that is you had the under 35 crowd, the 35 to 54 crowd, and the 55 plus crowd. And they were relatively different from about 2014 through 2018. And then in 2018, we see that they're all now kind of right together. And I was wondering if you have any insight on one, what maybe contributed to that strange spike from 2014 to 2015. And then, why now they all seem to be more unified in that. Is that wages have increased some, the market's doing well? Do we know anything about why the age groups seem to be now more unified on job satisfaction than they have been in the past?
Unfortunately, our survey doesn't allow us to make assumptions from the data. And we can just sort of track these results and then try to understand them. And I think what you mentioned about the fact that there was a very big difference in 2015 with the overall satisfaction of the 55 plus being very low, and the overall satisfaction of the group under 35 was pretty high. And then the trends have sort of shifted over time, and now they're all converging. And the only thing I can say is that there's a tight labor market, and that I think that it's easier to get a job, but I'm not sure why job satisfaction has decreased for those under 35. Although, Calvin, you're part of that group. Maybe, do you have a hypothesis?
Well, I also feel like I can't speculate on how my entire generation feels. But what I think is the more interesting takeaway from this graph isn't necessarily comparing the groups, rather seeing that the general trend is that all three groups are increasing. That we do see that wage satisfaction across the board is steadily rising. And even if you look at the comparative differences, you can say, yes, people under 35 are more satisfied with their wages than people over 55. But that difference is a 1.8% difference. That isn't much in the grand scheme of things. So really the big picture here is that everyone's becoming more satisfied with their wages rather than, one group or another is more or less satisfied.
One of the interesting things that I found, and Lance, if you want to expand on this at all, on the State of Us, we've been covering for probably the past 2 years now, the discrepancy in where wages are at today versus relative to, where they were, for example, in the 1950s through the 1980s. And when we went off of a standard increase in the minimum wage every year, when the federal government quit doing that. And what we found was, that, on average, most workers earning minimum wage today have roughly half the buying power, of 50 years ago, people who were working at minimum wage. So part of why this data is striking to me, and part of, I'm sure, what has garnered some of our listeners' interest in this is we say that there's there's an increasing satisfaction with wages. And yet in reality, while wages are indeed going up, they don't at all seem to be where they need to be, on the average. So the question that I'm curious in is, do we have any insight on, or I guess opinion more than anything else here on, is this because workers are actually happy with less than what workers used to be, or is it just they expect less because they've grown up and lived in a world where this has been the reality?
To address the first point here, these two data points aren't necessarily contrasting each other. If you look at the highest number, which is people between the age group of 35 to 54, their wage satisfaction is still at 48.2%. That's still less than half of people are satisfied with their wages. So I don't think that these two positions are necessarily contrarian. It's more so that, what we're gauging here is satisfaction. This bare minimum of you're okay with what you have. That doesn't mean you're thriving. That doesn't mean you're doing great. It just means you're okay. So I think that these points aren't necessarily contrasting each other.
Well, and that makes sense. I think one thing that happens too when stuff like this is released, and one of the great reasons to have the people on who are part of the report is to remind people that maybe sometimes the flashy headlines they see, people read into them perhaps a little too quickly. Because when you hear more workers under 35 satisfied with pay, I think there's that. There's a lot of people probably who make that initial jump to people under 35 are happy with how much they get paid. And it's, as you broke down there and I think explained well, that's not necessarily what that means. It means that there are more people under 35 today than there were, say, in 2017, from 45.4% to 48.2%, who are satisfied with their wages, which is different than saying that there's all these people happy with their wages.
But it's still less than 50% of, 53% are unhappy.
We got plenty of space to improve.
To improve, exactly.
Yeah.
It's important, I think, in general, when reading research and looking at data, is to understand that these differences, especially group differences, are all comparative. These are all relative differences. And really, you always have to take a step back and look at the big picture here. What is this data actually saying as a whole? And what the wage chart that we have in the report is actually saying is that overall, all three groups are seeing a steady increase in wage satisfaction. It's still not great, but we are seeing an increase.
There's some improvement taking place. And one of the big things that we focus on the State of Us is about putting forward real solutions to problems, or at least talking about what's next. Where do we go from here? And that's what we're going to look at coming up. But before we do that, Lance, we're working toward a common goal here at TrueChat. What is that?
Well, TrueChat's mission is to educate people by providing honest, open, and respectful conversations.
And in keeping in line with that mission, we try to make access to information very easy at thestateofus.org. You can access the articles that we reference on any given episode. And in today's case, you can access the report and some of the graphs and charts that we're looking at. Want to make sure that that's available to you in order to be able to fully understand what we're talking about and see some of these graphics for yourself. So please do take a look at those. And we're going to continue our conversation here with Dr. Robin Erickson. And a special thanks to Calvin Rong for taking the time to be on today with us. Much appreciated, Calvin.
Thank you for having me.
So stick around. Our conversation with Dr. Robin Erickson on where we go from here is yet to come.
We are The State of Us. Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
Welcome back. One of the main goals of The State of Us is to discuss solutions and talk about actionable items. We've been looking at worker satisfaction and the increase that we've seen to nearly 54% of U.S. workers being satisfied with their job. Now, that may not sound very impressive, but part of what we've hopefully done is put in perspective that this is increasing, particularly since the recession back in 2008 to 2010. And so what we're seeing with this is encouraging results, but there's plenty of ground to make up, and that's what we're going to focus on here. We're still joined by Dr. Robin Erickson, who is a principal researcher in human capital and was one of the contributors to this survey. So thanks for sticking with us, Robin, and let's get right into helping us understand, what can workers do to affect their satisfaction more? Because we often look at, what can a business do? And we're going to talk about that. But before we do, let's look at, what can the workers do?
Thanks, Justin. There are some things that I think that employees can do. And the first is that I think that they need to be conscious that there's a difference between job satisfaction and employee engagement. So what do I mean by that? Well, an employee can be satisfied with his or her work, but they may not be engaged, because job satisfaction is a precursor to employee engagement. So you can think about the difference between someone who is satisfied with a job that pays the bills, and they're able to create a better life for their children, versus someone who loves their job. They think it's intrinsically motivating. They think it's a calling, and they're willing to go the extra mile at their work. So I guess my suggestion is to think about, when you are choosing a job, if you're able to, think about one that has work that you can be engaged with, as well as satisfied with. And so the next suggestion is to think about, when you take a job, the things that people are most satisfied with in terms of their current satisfaction levels. They're things like commute to work, which you choose before you take a job, or the people at work, because you choose typically who you hang out with. You may not be able to choose your team workers, but you can choose the people who you go to lunch with. The interest in work, which is something that you know when you take a job, and then the physical environment. So those are the top four job components that employees are most satisfied with. And so I think that the hint to employees is to just be really careful about, when you pick a job, think about, those things that you have control over. You're not going to have as much control over things like your potential for future growth, your ability to get along with your supervisor, but you can think about those other things.
So do you think those are just the main ones where people are satisfied, or what else would you say you should look for as an employee? You mentioned the top four, and okay, yes, I should look at those. I agree wholeheartedly with you, but do you have any other suggestions as to like what I could look for? Because I have two professional daughters, and one of them just moved jobs, and she did take a job based on the opportunity for growth. Instead of going to a smaller business where there wasn't much room for growth, she went to a bigger business, but took a lower level job in the hopes, though, that there would be more on the back end. So are there other components of the 23 that are more in the worker's control?
Well, they're able to pick a job. I mean, we looked at how strong of a driver wages were, and wages are very important to employees. And so that's something that they can know when they take a job. But something else that's really important to them is, like you said, that potential for future growth, or if there's an ability to know in advance what the educational or job training programs will be. I think those are a couple of things that they could look at as well.
Well, because I really like the fact that you started with the employee, that so many times workers say, well, what am I supposed to do? I'm just work here. I think we have a lot of control over how well we enjoy our life, and that being work being a large part of that. And I think people poo-poo that and think, well, I'm working, so you mean I'm supposed to be happy here too? I think so. I really like the fact that you said that, and I think you've given them some ideas to think about as they look for a job or they look for a new job, that they should factor some of these things in. And it's not all on the boss. It's not all on the company to find satisfaction and to find engagement. A lot of that is on you as the employee to put yourself in those positions where you will feel the happiest, where you will feel the best.
We have a tight labor market right now, one of the tightest ever. Unemployment is a 50-year low, and
record
the
low,
quits rate or the voluntary turnover level is very high. So if you're not happy in your job, now is a great time to look for a new job.
Exactly. Right.
Well, when workers have more control, obviously, that also, I think the tight labor market's interesting because it also forces employers to be more interested in employee engagement and more interested in how can we improve worker satisfaction, because if we're having trouble acquiring talent, then we also have to be very conscious of how can we differentiate from the competition. What do we offer that others don't in order for us to get the right type of workers? So you've kind of got this, you got a lot of different factors at play, I guess. And we've talked a little bit about the employee side of things so far, the worker side of things. But let's talk too now, Robin, about from the employer's perspective, the business perspective, what are things that they need to be focusing on?
Sure. Well, and you're exactly right, because not only are companies having trouble right now acquiring talent, they're also having issues retaining talent. And so we do have 5 suggestions for organizations, and I'll go through these quickly. The first is to implement or enhance a total talent mobility program to demonstrate that growth potential to employees. So just as you were saying, potential for future growth is very important. It's the strongest driver of job satisfaction, actually, but only 39.3% of workers are satisfied with it. So organizations need to think about communicating and implementing their total talent mobility, which combines both global mobility and internal mobility, that career development, that path progression that we were talking about. The second is that we need to consider the transparency of communication channels and determine whether to make improvements. And I know some people out there are thinking, oh my gosh, I get so many emails. Please don't do anything that would give me more communication. But it's the second highest driver of job satisfaction.
I think you're absolutely right. That's probably what most people's mind goes to in terms of we've got, I don't want more emails. I don't need more communication. Communication, unfortunately, I think has, sometimes receives a bad rap because of that idea that it's the employer talking at me. I think it also comes in, you bring in the transparency component from an employer standpoint. The more clear you can be about the way processes work is a type of communication. And then obviously it's hopefully if the employer, right, is doing an effective job, it's not just what you're sending out to employees. It's about what are you doing to receive input from employees as well.
It's not a one-way street. And unfortunately, too many times in the employee-employer process, it's management talking to the worker and not listening to the worker. And I know when I was working full-time, that was one of my biggest frustrations. I felt like my voice wasn't being heard, that nobody was listening to me. I was on the line. I was in the classroom. I was the one doing the job, yet my input wasn't valued. And I think that's one way people don't need to think of, well, communication means, God, they're going to send me more information. It's that my boss listens to me, because I know when I did have people above me who listened to me, I was much happier at work.
Definitely. And so our recommendation is just that organizations should do an audit of all their communication channels to determine which ones are the most effective and provide the most transparency, and then allow them to also do that continuous listening that you were just mentioning. Our third suggestion is that organizations should create or enhance an employee recognition program. And that's because recognition acknowledgement stands out as the third strongest driver of job satisfaction, but only 36.9% of employees are satisfied with it. And many people are going to say, oh, well, we can't spend any more money on financial employee recognition. You know, we're worried about a recession, so we're going to tighten our belts. But employees appreciate both private and public acknowledgement of their accomplishments. And some of the best practice organizations have actually implemented an employee-to-employee recognition program, where an example of one is where each employee is given $20 a month, and they can share that or give it to one employee, but it's their responsibility to give those dollars away and to tell employees what they did that they appreciated.
That's really good. And it's so simple, and it's not even money. It's just like yesterday, my athletic director asked me for something, and I, downloaded it and sent it to him. And I wake up this morning and he just very quickly typed in, "Thanks a lot," and I was like, hey, he responded, he didn't need to take the time, the 5 seconds to respond to me and thank me for doing something that is a part of my job, but he did. And obviously now that makes me feel like, well, the next time he asks me for something, I'm going to be much more likely to get on that and get that back to him than I would have if he just blew me off. Like, yeah, well, you should have gotten it to me, so I like the point that you guys make, that it doesn't have to be money. I mean, you gave the example of money, and I think that's wonderful, because I know my wife does that at work. We'll be out and she'll buy little $2, $3 trinkets for coworkers, and she'll leave them on their desks at work. And they walk in, they go, "Did you leave this for me?" And she goes, "Well, yeah, I just saw it and thought of you." And they're like, "You just made my whole week." I was having a bad week or a bad day. It doesn't have to be a lot, which is my frustration when I dealt with my bosses. It's like, you don't have to spend a lot of money. You don't even have to spend any money. Just acknowledge when you see somebody do something, just say something to them. And it really goes a long way. And I'm noticing too, as you're reading these, the amount of satisfaction is going down. So, it's almost like we're getting to the things that the workers are least satisfied with. So if you're an employer, you need to look at this and, where can you find your most growth? We'll start where people are the least satisfied.
So the next item, right, is performance reviews and figuring out if people are inspired by. I loved that choice of words for this, because I think people say the word performance review, right? And inspired is probably one of the things that for most workers, unfortunately, is pretty near the bottom.
Oh, exactly. Gallup found that only 14% of employees strongly agree that their performance reviews inspire them to improve. Well, isn't that what a performance review is for? I think most people hate their performance review process. And so when I was writing this section of the report, I thought, well, what is most important? Because I think performance management is in flux in many organizations. Some are eliminating ratings and forced rankings and putting in a continuous listening program. And then others have said, well, that's not allowing us enough room to differentiate performance, so we're going to go back to the way we did it before. And I mean, I've been in companies where, the performance management process changed every year. And so I decided that the most important thing that people could do is ask if their employees are inspired by their performance review. And if they're not, what would inspire them? And start from there when you start to think about your performance management process.
So, and then the last thing, and this one may be the one of everything that's mentioned that is like, man, if somebody could nail this, they would have found a gold mine. I mean, I completely agree, but it's monitor and decrease employees' workload when necessary to foster more work-life balance. Obviously, there's a ton that goes into this particular point, so we probably don't have time to delve into it entirely. But what are you thinking there from a brief overview, Robin?
Sure. So the challenge with workload and work-life balance is that technology allows us to work 24/7. And
I think that when the recession came, organizations were forced to do more with less, more with fewer people. And then in a tight labor market, organizations often operate with unfilled positions. So you're increasing the workload of your remaining employees, which decreases their work-life balance. It lowers their morale and engagement and decreases their health. And so now you can see in many organizations, we have this big push for well-being. And I do think the well-being is important, but, maybe start back at the root cause, which is employees are being asked to do too much. I mean, how often have you worked in an organization where someone's left and they've been replaced with 2 people? That just shows you that the employee that had the job was doing too much. So I think organizations need to monitor workload and think about work-life balance.
A lot of this, I think, boils down to mindfulness. And that's a big thing that we're about here at the State of Us, is regularly taking time to analyze and examine current processes to figure out if they're effective, and making sure that communication one is one that I'm all over. I mean, that's kind of obviously what Lance and I are doing here for a living. So it's, it's definitely speaks to us, but I think it's too often it's undervalued. And if we put more value into the two-way communication street, I think a lot of these other things might self-resolve. So, Dr. Robin, thank you so much for taking time to speak with us. We really do appreciate it. The insight, I think, was invaluable, and I'm sure that our listeners got a lot of info from it. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
Lance, we've encouraged people to tune in, right? Mm-hmm. To invite their friends to be part of this conversation. So when you're out telling people, when Dr. Robin's out telling everybody how to listen, what are the various ways she could point them to?
Well, we have Spotify, Stitcher, Apple Podcast, and anywhere else fine podcasts are found.
So there's a lot of options.
A lot of ways, and I'm teaching people every day how to get there, which is amazing when you think of my technology skills.
That is. It shows that anybody can do it, right?
If I can do it, anybody can. It's exactly right.
And when in doubt, you just go to thestateofus.org. Thestateofus.org. We've got all the articles there, all the ways to listen. It's your one-stop shop for everything The State of Us.
That's exactly right.
For The State of Us on TrueChat in Urbana, Ohio, I'm Justin T. Weller.
And I'm Lance Jackson.
Thank you so much for tuning in. We'll see you next time. Be the change.